Had a narrow escape. The picture they had up where I was wearing the purple shirt, that's the other shirt I brought with me. I was almost wearing the same shirt, but I went with the green. Okay, so I'm going to be drawing together some ideas from my two books. So my 2016 book, The Secret of Our Success, I try to develop an evolutionary framework for thinking about culture, really drawing a bunch of insights that have been developing in the field of cultural evolution. And then my effort to explain global psychological variation, the weirdest people in the world. But I figured for this group, I thought there might be a lot of interest in economic growth, and I think understanding global psychological variation, informal institutions, family structures, and ultimately religion plays a role in my story. We're going to eventually get to economic growth. So I wanted you to have that in mind. Of course, for a long time, economists have been pointing to some factors that affect economic growth. So innovation, clearly that's been crucial. Economic historians often point to the Industrial Revolution, starting in the middle of the 18th century, as really driving the differences in prosperity among nations in the world today. Formal institutions. More recently, scholars like Daron Acemoglu and Jim Robinson have argued for the importance of pluralistic, representative democratic institutions in fostering economic growth. And then, of course, going back to Adam Smith and even before, the importance of specialization and the gains from trade, so Smithian growth. Now, I'm interested in how culture eventually influences all of these things. And so by culture, I'm going to say more about this in a second, but aspects of our minds are affected by the world in which we grow up in, so it means aspects of our psychology are cultural, some aren't cultural, and then social norms and what I'm going to call informal institutions, with a real emphasis on families. So that's kind of the big picture, eventually getting to economic growth. Now, one of the challenges, I think, with talking about culture is the way that the social sciences have so frequently talked about culture. You know, I'm an engineer, right? I did engineering for a couple years after my undergraduate. I like things to be really concrete and measurable, and culture always seemed like kind of this haze around us that somehow influences. I didn't like anthropology's version of culture. But I was fortunate in where I ended up at UCLA. There were scholars working on more systematic ways of thinking about culture from an evolutionary perspective. And since then, over the last 30 years, there's been a great blossoming of work thinking about culture from an evolutionary perspective. And at the core of that is thinking about culture this way. So culture is whatever we learn from other people. So it's acquired via social learning. You can think of it in different ways, and cognitive scientists have figured out different ways to chop it up. Economists like beliefs. There's also motivations, heuristics, practices, ways of thinking, aspirations, and many other things in that list. Broadly, you can think of it as information. So in an engineering sense, it's information that's stored in our brain somehow that got there via our interaction and learning from other people. One of the key insights about humans, and developmental psychologists like Mike Tomasello have really emphasized this, that compared to other primates, humans are imitation machines. We show up in the world and we start looking at others, watching copying. We acquire language this way. We acquire social norms. And this is going on unconsciously all the time. So our decisions are influenced by the opinions, views, and judgments of those around us outside of our conscious awareness. And so this is the basic approach laid out in this book. But to get at that and to think systematically about culture, I'm going to give you really the core ideas and the secret of our success in one slide. So sorry if this is a little broad. So, you know, I'm an evolutionist, right? So I think about humans from an evolutionary perspective. I take as a given we're a kind of ape, we're a tropical primate. We evolved from an ancestor we share with chimpanzees something like 6 million years ago. A lot of features of humans can only be understood as a kind of ape. So we have social status, we have dominance, we have postures that look similar to apes. But we can use this way of thinking to then theorize not only about a variety of aspects of human psychology, but also about how we learn from others. So there's a large body of formal models that make predictions now about how we should learn from others, when we should attend to some individuals versus others, when we should learn on our own and ignore other people, and when we should rely on genetically evolved predispositions. And since then, over the last 30 years, there's now a large body of evidence showing that this is actually how many children learn and how adults often learn from other people. And then you can build models. Again, we're trying to build a science here of cultural evolution, so we can build models of how, once we know how people learn, we can say, okay, people learn this way, they interact with others, what arises from that? And so these are cultural products. So you can get increasingly complex tools. So this leads to fancier tools, rituals, other kinds of practices, social norms and institutions, which I'll say more about in a second, and increasingly complex languages. So these are cultural products that shape the milieu that children grow up in and need to learn to navigate. So this affects aspects of our psychology non-genetically as we adapt as children and then even as adults to environments shaped by these cultural features. And so there's quite good evidence for all of these aspects of our psychologies being shaped by these things. So one of the folk distinctions that we have is we tend to use the digital computer metaphor to think about the mind. So we think about hardware and software. But what we know from neuroscience is that that's not actually how the brain works, that it actually shapes the interconnections among neurons as we grow up and as we're exposed to diverse environments. So you can change your visual processing by growing up in different environments. We see different illusions depending on where you grow up. Self-regulation is affected by things like the religious devotions you engage in while growing up. Pro-social motivations, how we think about numbers, and even how we think about space. So some languages, like English, have 3 different coordinate systems. So we can talk about north, south, east, and west, right and left. And we have a third one where I could say he's to the right of the camera. And I'm using a kind of relative to me and the camera and then go into the right of that. Other languages just do north, south, east, and west. And so people who grow up in a world with just northeast and north, absolute coordinates, get really good at tracking absolute coordinates. And if you say, which way is Dallas, they're just like, well, it's right there, which probably many of us couldn't just point in an accurate direction. So that's just an example. And it's important to get away from the dualism which pervades so much of our thought. So these cultural practices result in non-genetic biological differences between people. So you can take identical brains, same genes, say, and then raise them in different cultural worlds, and they are biologically different at the end. You get different hormonal reactions, you have different circuitry, and different cognitive abilities. A well-studied example of this is reading. So in some societies, all the kids are required to learn to read as children, and by the time they grow up, they have a thicker corpus callosum. That's the information highway that connects the left and right hemispheres. They have specialized circuitry in the left ventral hemisphere that allows them to read fast. So that's a biological difference between people who grow up in a literate society and a non-literate society. And it affects all kinds of things besides reading. Okay, now I'm also interested in the long run how the presence of these institutions and technologies have shaped our genetic evolution. For the purposes of today's talk, that's not going to play a role, but that's in the background in the secret of our success. And it's important for understanding many features of human cognition. Okay, so once you have this understanding of culture, you can get a ground-up understanding of institutions. And again, one of the things that always bothered me about the social sciences is economists do this today. They assume institutions exist. Why are there institutions? Chimps don't have institutions. So as an evolutionist, I need a story. I need a theory that explains why humans have institutions. Where do they come from? So there's a nice body of theory, mathematical models, showing that if you learn from others and you socially interact, all you need to do is acquire a behavior from other members of your group and the standards for judging others. We don't associate with people who eat pig. And so then you have a stable norm, don't eat pig, and then anybody who doesn't go along with that gets punished and sanctioned. And so that's going to proliferate a whole bunch of different social norms. And so I've made the case in The Secret of Our Success that humans have a norm psychology, so that we come into the world prepared for there to be norms. We don't know what they are, but there's going to be these widely shared rules for which if you deviate, you get punished. Now, if you have a collection of those norms, you create an institution. So a simple example, long before there were laws or courts or anything like this, humans had marriage practices. This is a package of social norms about the responsibilities of each member, about what the families are supposed to do, about where they live after they get married, about who gets paid. So in some societies, the bride's parents get paid, and some it's the husband's. So that's a set of norms governing this institution of marriage. And really where the distinction comes in is the formal institution, when you write down how the institution's supposed to work, and then that piece of that written document moves through time and has to be reinterpreted. Okay, so in this talk, I'm going to try to argue for I'm going to make a series of claims and arguments. The first is that there's substantial psychological variation around the globe that's important for understanding the functioning of political institutions and economic outcomes. Now, this should be surprising to you, because if you take a course, maybe until very recently, in social psychology, a lot of this would be invisible. And as I'll point out in a second, nearly all, 95, 96% of the subjects studied by psychologists are Americans, university students, or European descent populations. And so the picture that you get in a typical social psychology class, or much of behavioral economics, is actually a picture of a peculiar population. So that's this, I'm going to say more about this term weird in a second, but weird is an acronym that stands for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. Again, I'll say more about that in a second. But this plot just gives you a sense of some of the variation. So this is the individualism around the world. You can see the US is particularly high on that. Australia, populations commonly studied by psychologists are highly individualistic. So they're an unusual population in a global perspective. This map shows the difference between trust in your in-group versus trust in your out-group. And again, relatively flatter in places like the US and the UK, but quite variable around the world. And the gray areas are terra incognito. So we don't really know what these things look like there. So we don't even have a full sense of the global variation. Okay, now this would be variations in beliefs and preferences if you're an economist. So economic models typically have two things, and that's all you got. But if you're a cognitive psychologist or cognitive scientist, we can find variation in attention, memory, perception, reasoning, decision styles, and decision biases. So if you're familiar with the behavioral economics literature, and this is a challenge, either we know the biases from the economics literature vary dramatically across societies, or we don't know at all. I know of no examples where it doesn't vary across societies in important ways, in consequential ways. Okay. So, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. So I just want to give you a sense of some of the other psychological variation that we can see with the available data. The first is something that's very intuitive for people raised in places like I was raised, like Philadelphia, is that intentions are important in making moral judgments. But it turns out in some societies, intentions aren't really attended to very much, or they're weighed a lot less. So if you judge whether someone committed a theft, it doesn't matter whether they took it on purpose or they did it by accident. So that varies. Analytic versus holistic thinking. So analytic thinkers break problems down into bits, and then they assign properties to the bits. They use those properties to explain the system. You can see it in physics, you can see it in economics, you can see it in psychology. Holistic thinkers look at relationships. So they characterize relationships and use that to explain the system. They attend to background and context. Non-relational morality. So does morality apply the same everywhere, or are there different moralities for different kinds of relationships? Dispositional thinking varies. So weird people, Westerners, tend to be very dispositional. They assign underlying hidden traits to individuals to explain their behavior. If somebody shows up to work, they're not punctual or they're lazy or something, as opposed to their tire was flat or there was some kind of situational thing that caused them to delay. That's this dispositional bias. Trust in strangers varies, conformity varies across societies, and patience, just to name a few. All potentially have important economic outcomes. Okay, so just say something about this backronym that Steve Heine and Oren Orenzion and I coined in 2010 in a paper with the title "The Weirdest People in the World." So this was meant as a consciousness-raising device. And it was to remind researchers that the populations most commonly studied by behavioral scientists are psychologically and behaviorally unusual. So it was meant to remind them of that. There is this collection of traits, which I'm going to try to explain, which I just talked about a second ago. And as I mentioned, so our paper was now 12 years ago. The last number I saw in this was that 95% of psychology subjects are weird. So we improved by 1% in 12 years. but at least people are attending to the issue. And as I mentioned, it affects all these different domains. And then finally, a caution. Don't set up a weird versus non-weird dichotomy in your mind. The acronym was meant as a consciousness-raising device. I'm going to show you that the variation is continuous and multidimensional. So you don't want to make two categories. That'll mislead you in all kinds of not good ways. Okay, the other thing I want to caution about is there's a tendency when you grow up in a society that's evolved, adapted our minds to particular institutions, languages, ways of doing things, to judge some traits with positive or negative valence. And so I use this conformity because if you grow up in Texas, this is actually an empirical fact, you tend to think conformity is bad. If a child is a conformist, that's not a nice thing to say about. If you say someone else is a conformist, that's not a good thing. In many places in the world, where I'm going to show you are high on conformity, that's a good thing. Children who show conformity and do what they're supposed to are highly valued and thought to be good children. So you try to watch your tendency to valence these things. Because the key idea that I'm arguing in this talk is that our minds and these psychological traits are adapted for navigating our societies. Now, you can get a mismatch. You can spread institutions which mismatch with a society's psychology, and that can cause lots of interesting problems. I talk about that in the last chapter of The Weirdest People in the World. Okay, so the real question is, why does this psychology vary? And so as I've been hinting at, it's going to co-evolve with institutions, languages, and technologies to create a fit. And then finally, what I said earlier is I'm interested in the implications. So in The Weirdest People in the World, I argue that we can understand the origins of the commercial, legal, and industrial revolutions which emerge over the last millennia in Europe once we understand that people's psychology is shifting and that the social constraints on them based on their kinship is shifting. It's going to affect the functioning of formal institutions, and it's going to help us understand why, after 1500, European populations expanded around the world, engaged in colonialism, were able to outcompete other societies militarily and economically. So just to give you a quick look, this is since 1800, and this is the growth in GDP per capita in Europe. So this is really this Industrial Revolution takeoff. So I'm going to get to innovation by the end of the talk. And I think once you understand the psychological changes that occur and the way this affected the institutions, we can do better theorizing about why the Industrial Revolution happened when and where it does. And we can also say something about contemporary innovation. So just to give you a quick summary of the weirdest people in the world, because I think it's good to have that as background. I'm really trying to explain, this is the British cover, which I tend to like a little better. The psychological variation that I mentioned, individualism, this impersonal pro-sociality, trust in strangers, analytic thinking. And the beginning of that story starts at an unlikely place, or at least the social sciences don't tend to see religion as playing a big role. There's a bunch of historians and anthropologists, actually. Jack Goody is the famous anthropologist, who argued that the one particular brand of Christianity, what's called the Western Church, so this is the branch of Christianity that evolves into the Roman Catholic Church, adopted a bunch of unusual practices, that taboos on cousin marriage became incest, bans on polygamous marriage. 85% of human societies allow men to take additional wives, so very unusual. Rules about inheritance that transformed the kin groups, which had clans and tribes and looked very much like the societies that anthropologists have studied, transformed them, at least parts of Europe, into monogamous nuclear families. Now you might think, doesn't everyone have monogamous nuclear families? No, super rare. And I'm going to show you a little bit of evidence on that. So the church does this transformation. That affects people's psychology. So I'm eventually going to show you evidence for this arrow. But that led to the creation of new institutions. So Europe, historians have long noted that Europe is unique in having many voluntary institutions. You've probably heard of guilds. These begin as self-help groups. So people lose their kinship, and they need to band together groups of strangers to insure each other. Monasteries begin spreading, adopting democratic practices. Unlike prior monasteries, they stop being family affairs. Charter towns begin spreading, where you join the town as a member, and then you have certain citizen obligations. And universities are actually either labor unions for professors or they emerge as labor unions for students. There's the Bologna model, and then there's the Paris model. Now, there's competition amongst these organizations, but unlike kin-based organizations, people can move fluidly from them, and so they begin to compete in ways that attract more members. This leads to greater urbanization, so people are moving to the charter towns, and so Europe has about 1% urbanization in 800, and it's passing China by 1200, and then passing the Middle East sometime around 1500, in the percent of people in urban areas. Occupational choice, people can move between occupations. They can apprentice with in different trades, which is not something you see elsewhere. The rise of impersonal markets begins spreading throughout Europe in the High Middle Ages. And I make the case in the book that all of these have effects on people's psychology. And then finally, the transformed psychology and social milieu leads to the rise of representative government, Protestantism, which is this very peculiar religion, greater innovation, the growth of financial markets, and greater economic growth. So that's kind of the big picture. And we're going to dig in on this arrow and this arrow just to illustrate. I want you to understand some of the ways we try to get evidence for these things. Okay, now I mentioned that you need to take an evolutionary approach, and we can't really understand human kinship without recognizing that we're a kind of ape. So like lots of other animals, we have a kin psychology, a tendency to help blood relatives. And when we look at the diversity of human kinship systems, it looks like it's trying to extend that. So lots of societies you call cousins brothers, and then you have obligations to your brothers. It's normatively enforced that you have to treat these people like brothers, even though people will make a distinction when push comes to shove. So it's not like they're totally duped, but it's just trying to extend the prosociality. Pair bonding, so like gorillas, humans form emotional bonds between males and females for the purposes of raising children. Marriage reinforces the pair bond. So it's a set of norms that manipulates and harnesses that pair bond, extends it, and you get marriage. And marriage actually is powerful because it connects children to their father's family. So you get to double your kinship through marriage. You create affines. And then finally, incest aversion. Like other animals, humans have to deal with the problem of inbreeding, avoiding sex with close relatives. But then lots of societies extend these into taboos and make rules against marrying your cousins. So hunter-gatherers typically can't have sex with their cousins or marry their cousins. But then other societies, that becomes a big thing. And you see that emerge as a way of building tighter social networks. Okay, so kinship systems are going to restructure human social networks in important ways. So if you like social networks, this is rewiring the fundamental human social networks. Now, just to give you, with apologies to the anthropologists, I'm going to summarize a great deal of anthropology in one slide. As some of you may know, humans lived in relatively small-scale hunter-gatherer groups until about 12,000 years ago, when the origins of agriculture occurs. These groups have extensive kinship ties, which allows them to avoid shocks, find water and find food resources in a patchy environment where there's weather shocks. They typically have bilateral inheritance. That means they inherit relatedness and other things through both mom and dad. And reciprocity and ritual play an important role. Now this pathway tightens the kinship system. So groups begun to have clans with the origins of agriculture. They have common ownership over the land. They have inherited status and ancestor worship. And all of these things kind of bind the group together to allow it to control territory more. Now, this leads to a wide range of different social structures, age sets, segmentary lineages, and simple chiefdoms. For now, we'll leave these aside because this is the important pathway. So simple chiefdom is the beginning of hereditary rulership. So it should be a puzzle to many of you as to why are there kings, and why is the king's son the next king, right? That emerges with simple chiefdoms. There's some interesting psychological reasons why that's a palatable idea to humans. But this is the pathway that goes to states. And so this has very complex kinship, and each of these are kind of born out of a logic of kinship, even the early states. Now there's all kinds of other ways in which cultural evolution has built human societies, but this is the pathway to states. And that's important for our story, because it means pre-modern states had this intensive network, clan, kinship stuff at both the elite level and at the lower strata level. So there's arranged marriages, your kin group is your social safety net, Everybody has a web of kinship obligations. It's the group that does economic production. Okay. And it's not clear how you get from this kind of state to what we think of as a modern state dominated by impersonal institutions. So one of the questions I'm trying to answer is how you get from pre-modern states to modern states. Now, I've been talking about this complex kinship, and for many of you, that may sound very strange. I remember when I first went to graduate school in anthropology at UCLA, I was kind of like, why are anthropologists obsessed with kinship? They constantly talk about kinship. The ethnography is always kinship, kinship, kinship. Then I went to work in Fiji, and now I understand. It's because that's what's on everybody's mind. They're just reflecting what's really important in these societies. So these are traits that characterize Western societies, typically. And this is the database I'm drawing on is called the Ethnographic Atlas. It's a data set of over 12,000 different societies that anthropologists have studied, and we can characterize their kinship according to its weirdness. So weird societies have bilateral descent, tracing through mom and dad. Most societies don't have that. That's actually rare, right? Cousin marriage, 75% of human societies, cousin marriage is either allowed or preferred. Many of you are probably not inclined to marry your cousins. Monogamous marriage, again, very, very rare. 85%, as I mentioned, of societies, men can take additional wives. Polyandry, very rare. I mean, it pops up here and there, but nuclear families, also rare, and then neolocal residence, where the bride and the groom set up a house or household independent of either side of the family. But all of these characterize many European societies. And if you do a count, so this is the percentage of the sample that had 0 of these traits, and this is the percent that have all 5, this is actually 50.1%. So the majority of societies have 0 of these weird traits. And there's only a small sliver here that have all 5. And when you dig into those, they're almost all European descent societies. So the French Canadians are in there, Yankees are in there, and or they're already Christianized societies. So in the Philippines and North America, where Spanish missionaries arrived long before the anthropologists, and so their practices were already changed. I actually did research on an island, the island of Cebu, which was the one that had, all 5 of these weird traits. And then I went to the journals of Ferdinand Magellan. Antonio Pigfetta wrote about Magellan's Chronicles. And Magellan gets there, and there's polygyny and cousin marriage and all this kind of stuff. And he starts preaching against it. He has his padres, and they're all upset about this stuff. And then, of course, Spanish missionaries come later. All right, so the family is a sensible place to look for something that might shape our minds because it's the oldest of human institutions, and it's also the first one that we encounter growing up. So when you're a little kid, you really just know about your family. Now, to give you a sense of how this might shape our minds, I want to just create a little dichotomy here between societies with intensive kinship, where you have lots of cousin marriage and your networks are given at birth, and a society where you have just monogamous nuclear families, so weak kinship. And so in this one, most of your relationships are given. You don't have much room to make new relationships. There's a lot of pressure to conform. You have responsibilities to these different relatives. In this world, you don't have much of that, but you have to cultivate dispositions and traits that will make you a worthy partner for mates and for friends and for business partners. So you need something to distinguish you. So that's leading to a world of individualism. Here, if you need a business partner or you need a carpenter, you're going to work through your kin ties. Your cousin knows a guy who can help you out. Here, you might look for the person with the best attribute or the highest ratings or something like that, some kind of impersonal institution. Here, you trust people based on how many other ties you have to them, because it's those other relationships that are going to make them behave. This, you're looking for trustworthy people. So it's a disposition. You're thinking about what's inside. This is a world of shame, where if you violate a rule, your family is going to feel shame, and you're going to feel small and want to withdraw. So norms are governing things here. Here, individuals adopt different standards for themselves. So I might feel guilt because I didn't go to work out on a particular day, but my neighbor doesn't care about that, and my brother's not going to take any heat because I didn't go to the gym. So it's a different way of operating. And then here, your identity is from your relationships and networks, and it's here these attributes that you're cultivating. Okay, so just to give you an example of intensive kinship in the modern world, so these are the Pashtuns in Afghanistan. So the Taliban is basically a Pashtun organization. So patrilineal inheritance of identity and land, so they determined by your clan. Over 50% of marriages are between cousins among the Pashtun. Polygyny, all of the Taliban leaders have 3 wives. Bride price. So this is where, as a male, you've got to come up with a whole bunch of goats, and you've got to pay those goats to the woman you'll marry. And when the Americans flooded Afghanistan with money, bride prices went way up. So then men ended up trying to join organizations like the Taliban in order to raise bride price. So that was actually an unintended consequence. And so there's a system of honor here based on a segmentary lineage system, and land is corporately owned. So I made a prediction in The Weirdest People in the World, which was finished in 2018, that democracy is not going to work in Afghanistan because the institutions are fundamentally at odds. And so at least that one held. Okay, then the question is, well, so, I've shown you evidence that the families that many of us are familiar with are actually unusual in a global and historical perspective. But when did that occur? A common assumption is that when you get wealthy, you just have monogamous nuclear families because that's what everybody wants, right? Well, it turns out historically that doesn't hold at all. So monogamous nuclear family in Europe go way back before industrialization and before people started getting wealthier in Europe. And in fact, we can track it using some interesting techniques. So many of you, well, all of you are familiar with English term for in-law, for affines, what anthropologists call affines. What's the in-law part? What's the law? It's in canon law. Every time you say sister-in-law or brother-in-law or mother-in-law, you're referencing canon law. And it's because the church made a law that you have to treat your sister-in-law like your sister. She's your sister in canon law, which means no sex, right? It's because it's taking the incest taboo and it's saying this now applies to your affine. That might sound weird, like who would want to have sex with their sister-in-law? Except that's very common in many societies. So there are marriage rules where if your wife dies, you get the sister if she's not married. Or you might, if you're polygynous, you would take her as another wife. Okay, and it's also, we find relics of it in our religious rituals. So if you've been to a Catholic or some Protestant weddings, the priest or preacher might have said something like this: if anyone can show just cause why this couple cannot be lawfully joined together in holy matrimony, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. And there's this pregnant pause. That is actually from the Carolingian Empire, so 800, year 800, and it was part of an effort by the Carolingians to get everyone together and one last time and say, are these two cousins? Do we have any reason to think they're related? Because the bans on cousin marriage were expanding, and it became less and less clear. So you get everyone together and you do one final check. So incest taboos, cousin marriage is banned out to 6 cousins by the year 1000, and then it's actually lowered a little bit. So the circle contracts in 1215 at the Fourth Lateran Council, but still includes third cousins, so quite a broad ban. I mean, 6 cousins, you can't even find them anyway, right? So it's just hypothetical. Polygyny is banned, no sex slaves as well, no arranged marriages. So the Christian marriage also has a place where the bride says, I do, which is actually pretty rare in marriage ceremonies. Nobody usually asks for the bride's opinion. But this is to make sure she's not being forcibly married. So the priest is supposed to be like, you do, right, really? So no arranged marriages. And the church also discourages corporate ownership and collateral inheritance. So it's trying to make everything lineal. Get rid of all those uncles who want a piece of the action on it. And this is, Jack Goody argues, this is because the church can get rich this way. So a lot of Christians who had land would bequest it to the church. But if there was collateral people grabbing at the land, then the church couldn't get full ownership to the land. So interesting story there. And this is Jack Goody's book, which is a great book. Okay, so the empirical, so this is an interesting historical story, but can we find evidence that this can actually explain everything? So the challenge that my collaborators and I placed for ourselves was we need to be able to link the church to kin-based institutions. So can we explain the frequency of cousin marriage by knowing something about the church? And can we link these kin-based institutions, cousin marriage, polygyny, inheritance rules, to this weirder psychology, individualism? And then if those two link, we should also be able to do this. Okay, Now to do that, we went to that thing I mentioned earlier, the ethnographic atlas, and we created a kinship intensity index. So that has all those interesting measures of cousin marriage and polygyny and clans and extended family. An economist named Ben Anke is also, he's my colleague at Harvard, so this arose from a discussion. He has a paper on this. And using some techniques which I can discuss, we're able to map the world using languages. And so this gives you the kinship intensity of populations around the world. As a second way of measuring that, because maybe that's just ethnographic data and maybe it's junk, right? So we need a second measure, cousin marriage data. So this is actual cousin marriages from countries around the world. We use Alan Biddle's data on that for most of the time. But when I do Europe, I'm going to use another technique where people really wanted to marry their cousins. But in the Catholic Church figured out later, so first it banned cousin marriage, then a few centuries went by, and then it realized it could monetize this. So it began selling the opportunity to marry your cousin to Europeans with enough money. So lots of kings and stuff married to just pay. The church made a lot of money, actually. And then we can look at the spread of the church and see if we can measure the duration to which a place is under the church's marriage and family program to explain some of this variation. So this is our paper in Science, and I'm going to just dip in and give you a few results. The first is the cross-national stuff, and that's not going to be very persuasive in terms of figuring out whether this is really causing, what the causality is. But it will show you that there's broad patterns around the globe that fit this story. Then we'll zoom in on Europe, and we'll take a look there. Unfortunately, for time, I won't be able to talk about Italy, but we can just look at Italy, and we can explain variation within Italy proper. Okay, so the behavioral economists in the room will know about the public goods game. So this is a simple behavioral experiment where you bring strangers together, you give them an allocation of money, say $20, and they can give between $0 and $20 to a common pot, which is then increased by some amount, say 50%, and then distributed equally amongst the group. So this is a repeated public goods game done by Benedict Herman and colleagues. And so this is the first round contribution. So if you're given a lot, you're up here, you're given a high percentage, and you're giving less here. And what you see is that the higher the kinship intensity, the less people give. And so these are different cities or countries around the world. So greater kinship intensity, lower first round contributions. Higher cousin marriage, lower first round contributions. Greater church exposure, higher first round contributions. So more centuries under the church, higher exposures. Now this line here, this dotted line, we also looked at the Eastern Church. So historically, it's not a control exactly, but the Western Church very enthusiastically implemented this marriage and family program. The Eastern Church did it with less enthusiasm, and the cousin marriage didn't go out as far, and so it just wasn't as enthusiastic. And what we often see is a weak version of what we see for the Western Church. So that broadly, that seems consistent. Now, one interesting thing is economist Ernst Farrar and his colleagues famously showed that if you allow people to engage in peer punishment, so after you cooperate, you give people a chance to punish. Some people punish the low contributors. That drives cooperation up, at least in Zurich, and then you get full cooperation. That doesn't work everywhere. It doesn't work at all in Middle Eastern countries. It doesn't work at all in parts of Russia. So peer punishment depends on whether you have high kinship or low kinship intensity. Okay, now that's just some lab work, not very many data points, lots of reasons to not be too persuaded. So we went and got data on voluntary anonymous blood donations around the globe, which gives us a lot of data points. And so we can look at greater kinship. And so this is a public good, like the public goods game. You give blood. You might need it, but you probably won't. It's costly. You got to go give the blood. So it's very similar, but greater kinship intensity, fewer voluntary blood donations to strangers. Same thing with cousin marriage, but greater church exposure, more voluntary blood donations. Also true for the Eastern Church with less of a strong result. And then we can try to hold constant a bunch of things. So notably, we hold constant religious denomination and religiosity. So we only compare Catholics with other Catholics and Protestants with other Protestants, as well as lots of geographic variables, essentially. Okay, now I could go through 17 different variables, that all the variables we could find around the world for which we had data from different countries, And it tells basically the same story. So this is in many ways a summary of it. We took all 17 psychological variables and combined them. And what you see is that more centuries under the church, lower rates of cousin marriage, more cousin marriage. I could also use kinship intensity there, but they both work fine. More cousin marriage, less individualistic and impersonal psychology. So lower individualism, less trust in strangers. And then finally, if you go directly, more centuries under the church, greater individualism, and more trust in strangers. And again, the weak result for the Eastern Church, the strong result for the Western Church. Okay, so that gives you a sense that there's some patterns going on at the global level. But to dig down into it more deeply, we created a database. This was led by Jonathan Schultz, in which we looked at the spread of the Catholic Church across Europe. So we have a GPS location for each bishopric, and we have a year. So, and then we can take the place and we can, draw a circle around the bishopric and say, everybody who lives in there got a dosage of the church for however many centuries that they were exposed. Now you'll notice that sometimes these turn gray, and that means a bishopric was founded, but then that plot of ground was conquered by somebody unfriendly to the bishop in Rome, so it's unfriendly to the Pope. So southern Spain, you'll see, gets a relatively low dosage of the marriage and family program because it's controlled by Islamic powers until it gradually goes down. But that's true in other places too. You can see that southern Italy is the same way. Okay, so these are the dosages of the marriage and family program across Europe. And we also are interested, we pay attention to the Iron Curtain, because a lot of people think that order had an important effect, so we need to attend to that. Interestingly, the Iron Curtain corresponds in most places to the Carolingian Empire. So, and there's a big cultural divide there. So, yeah, so let's leave it there. And so the Carolingian Empire really implements the marriage and family program with a great deal of gusto, because they kind of team up with the Pope. Okay, then we go to the European Social Survey, and we get measures for 4 of the things we think are relevant here. So conformity and obedience, individualism, independence. These are just questions that people are answering. Impersonal fairness and impersonal trust. And so people answer these questions on a score of 0 to 10, and we can use that as a psychological measure. And then what we do is we take the amount, so we have them in space, and we look at how long the region they lived in was under the church. And we find that individuals from regions with longer church exposure show greater impersonal trust, greater impersonal fairness, less conformity and obedience, and greater individualism independence. We have 200,000 people in 442 regions. Now, you immediately your mind might be thinking, well, what could explain these? One thing we do is we hold the country constant. So there's nothing about national healthcare systems, national GDP, anything like that. We're only comparing people in the same country. We also try to eliminate other possibilities. So we control for income and education. One of people's sort of gut go-to hypotheses is all about income and education. I must find that's usually not about those things. Geography and climate. We have a map of the Roman roads, which allows us to control for Roman influence. Initial prosperity in 500, as well as things like medieval universities, monasteries, presence of the Carolingian Empire. And then we also redo the analysis, just look at socialist Europe. And we get the same result when we look at socialist Europe. Okay, now I could show you evidence that the Western Church is associated with less cousin marriage in the 20th century. It was very hard to find cousin marriage data, but we went to the dispensations, and that gives us at least a proxy for cousin marriage. So I could show you that. But more interestingly, I can show you that cousin marriage predicts various aspects of psychology in the 20th century. So this is cousin marriage in the 20th century, and these are our same measures from the European Social Survey. So more cousin marriage, more conformity and obedience. And you can see that mostly it works within countries too. We also added Turkey. Turkey obviously has a different history than the rest of Europe, although it's contiguous. But it has high cousin marriage, and it falls right where you'd expect. So Turkey looks like how you'd expect, given it didn't get the church's marriage and family program. Similar thing with trust. Less individualism, independence when you have less cousin marriage, and less impersonal fairness. There's only 68 data points. We try to put in as many alternative hypotheses as possible. Mostly things hold up. Okay, I really like this approach, and it's a technique that we took from economics more generally. But we take that same social survey and we pull out just the second-generation immigrants. So these are people whose parents come from somewhere else in the world, but they grew up all in the same European country. They're fluent in the local language. They speak like a local, all those kinds of things. And we find that, and then we attach to them a measure of their kinship intensity based on where their parents are from. So the idea is that they're learning something from their parents or the social milieu their parents put them in, and then that's going to create an echo effect. And we find the same pattern of results. So when your parents came from a place with higher kinship intensity or more cousin marriage, I should say lower kinship intensity, less cousin marriage, you get greater trust, fairness, less obedience and conformity, and greater individualism and independence. And here again, it's not due to income or other demographics or education. We also control for the feeling of being discriminated against in case there's something going on there, and a variety of different checks. And this is a very robust result. Again, only comparing immigrants from different places now living in the same European country. Okay, so that's trying to give you a sense that the church had this impact on how people think about the world. And then the question is, does this affect things like innovation, and could it affect things like economic outcomes? Well, in the book, I mean, I build on this idea that I develop in The Secret of Our Success, that a lot of innovation and what I call cumulative cultural evolution is driven by the collective brain. So most ideas are recombinations of other ideas that come from another person. So if you copy one idea from one person, one idea from another person, put them together, you've made a new idea. And you actually didn't come up with anything. You just took two different ideas and mixed them. That's really the source of a huge amount of innovation. And I'm not just speculating that. Analyses of the patent database suggest that that's in fact the case, the US patent database. Okay, now the story I've been laying out for Europe since about 1000 is that you're getting more fluid interaction between cognitively diverse individuals. So I mentioned urbanization passes China in the year 1200. Cities are hubs of innovation. So the interesting thing about cities is that not only do you get more innovations in larger cities, but you get disproportionately more innovation. It's as if the people get more creative when they live in a larger city. Population density shows similar effects. There's now a number of papers in economics showing the power of immigration to drive innovation. So counties in the US that got more shocks of immigration, just due to random stuff like they laid a railroad track by that town and it's got a shock of immigration, were more innovative in the years subsequently. So there's lots of immigration going on in Europe. There's lots of urbanization. Institutions also are showing the effect. So I looked at apprenticeship institutions in China, India, and Europe. And only Europe has the journeyman phase. So journeyman is kind of like a postdoc. First you apprentice somebody. It might be somebody in your hometown. You learn how to become a weaver or a blacksmith or something. Then you have to go far away. And often distance is important because your master doesn't want to compete with you. So he sends you far away to become a journeyman, and you go to another master's shop. And there you interact with other journeymen who came from other places. So it's a rich chance to recombine ideas. Whereas in the China and India model, it's mostly kept within the clan. You're very careful about letting secrets move out. So this is going to create recombination. Universities or other knowledge-based institutions are going to provide the flow of ideas, lead to lots of interaction. So universities are associated with economic growth in European history. The printing press and literacy, of course, can do a lot of work there. But this is all hinges on the existence of psychological factors. So if you don't trust other people, you're not going to share stuff with them. So it's based on a certain amount of trust and cooperation with strangers. Individualism and nonconformity. To innovate, you need to be nonconformist because you've got to do something differently than other people have had. And if you live in a society where that's considered a good thing, you're going to get one set of behaviors. If it's not a good thing, you're going to get a different set of behaviors. And individualism means cultivating something. So people are cultivating their creativity. That's one of the things they have to offer, their innovativeness, that kind of thing. So individualism can help there. Preference for novelty, breaking with tradition, openness to breaking with tradition, and value and creativity can all play a role. and tolerance of differences is crucial. So one of the things I suggest in the book is that Philadelphia, drawing on other people, is that Philadelphia outcompetes Boston because Philadelphia had complete religious tolerance. And so Quakers and all kinds of non-conforming Protestants wind up in Philadelphia, and then Philadelphia is more innovative than Boston. Okay, so now I want to get back to some data, except I want to try to convince you that this matters in the modern world. So this is from a global patent data set from 1980 to 2014. And these are my co-authors, and this is ongoing work. So the first thing we wanted to do was show that these psychological traits actually do predict the number of patents. And then we're going to show that having monogamous nuclear families and sprawling networks is also associated with patents in the way we expect, and that the church can then be used to explain these. So it's the same pattern. So this is our patents. This is the map of Europe. And we have this at what's called the NUTS 3 level. So a very fine 1,400 different little regions of Europe. We count the number of patents in each region. And then this is our measure of weirdness of your psychology. So we can use any of these traits individually, but we put them all together using a statistical technique which gives us the single dimension, which best captures the variation in these. They're all pretty highly correlated. And then we use this to predict this. And the question is, does it predict the number of patents? And the answer is, yeah, it's actually pretty impressive. So the weirder Europeans are, we're only comparing Europeans to other Europeans here, right? So we're explaining variation within Europe. We hold the country constant, just comparing people in the same country. And the weirder the folks in one of these little blocks is, the more patents they're going to tend to have. So a standard deviation increase in how weird you are results in between a 0.27 and 0.43 standard deviation increase in patents per capita. So you're getting more inventions per person in the places that are more individualistic, more non-conforming, more trusting. Trust, share information. Okay. Now we can do the same thing with the family networks. So we have a measure of the number of nuclear family households at the NUTS level. And then we have Facebook friends more than 100 miles away. So do you have extensive ties? Are you kind of drawing in from a broad network, or do you just know people in your own hometown? And we can do the same thing. So either one of these will predict more patents. So a standard deviation increase in faraway Facebook friend gives you a quarter of a standard deviation increase in patents per capita. People are more creative when they have more sprawling ties. It's because it's a collective brain that's better wired. Okay, and this just gives you one glimpse at our effort to go all the way, to go from number of years of church exposure to patents per capita. This is controlling for several things. And this is also bin, which always cleans things up, but it's a pretty tight correlation. Okay, now I shouldn't show this. I'm violating rules of good presentation. I didn't know how else to do this. I was super excited about my IV regression. So this is a technique from economics meant to an effort to get towards causality. I'm trying to explain here patents per capita. And what I'm trying to do is I'm going to say, well, there's a case that can be made that the medieval church expanded in idiosyncratic and random ways, so that where your bishopric got located was affected by all kinds of factors that were essentially random with respect to patents. And so we can use that medieval church exposure to try to explain weird psychology. So the church is making people weirder, and then that changed psychology is going to make people have more patents. And so this works really well. Now, whether it demonstrates causality remains a matter of debate, because we can make a case for this, but it's far from, I'm not totally confident. But anyway, I thought it was a fun result. So the basic insight, we can do this for all those variables, but the basic result here is that it seems that the medieval church, or at least the evidence suggests that the medieval church influences contemporary innovation, possibly via its influence on family structure and its downstream impact on social networks, the Facebook stuff, and various aspects of psychology. So this is very specific to Europe because we have a really good measure of the expansion of the church with the global data set, with the church database. Now the question is I want to get around to the economic growth that I promised you at the beginning. So family organizations, our kinship intensity measure, vary for lots of reasons. One is religion, but there's also ecological factors and how long agriculture has been around and things like that. So what we did was, this is back to the same story. perspective. We took this measure that economists have been using, measure of economic prosperity. What this is nighttime luminosity. So you take a picture of the Earth at night, and you look at where it's lit up. And you can do a bunch of checks, and you can show that most of the time this is pretty highly correlated with other measures of economic prosperity, how much the economic engine is running. So this is the 2010 data. And then we go to the anthropologists, and we're back to our data set of kinship. And we get our measure of kinship intensity, which we map the world with. And we basically are putting these two together. Now, there's going to be a reverse causality question. Maybe economic prosperity causes this kinship intensity. But we're using 2010 data, and we're using data from that dates about 1900 is the typical time of the observation for this kinship intensity. So you can't tell a simple reverse causality story. You can tell a more complex one, but there's no way that this caused something back in time, except for some temporal paradox. Okay, I shouldn't. I'm not supposed to put this in. So what I'm trying to do here, you don't have to look at that, is I'm trying to explain the variation in light intensity, and I'm using the kinship intensity. And I'm holding the country constant. So I'm just comparing different groups that live in the same country. And what I'm able to show is that groups that have higher kinship intensity are less well lit up, meaning they have less economic prosperity. And we can include population density. So this is the economic growth over and above what you would normally account for by population density. So we're accounting for the number of people. So you could also you could move this to the other side, and then you could make this log light density per capita. You can use lots of geographic controls. You can control for continent. You can put malaria in or political hierarchies, and the result holds pretty well. Now, so that gives us some reason to think it might be the case. We did one other analysis which we really liked, and this is another kind of fancy technique from economics, but it's pretty easy to understand. We looked at, within each country, we have different ethnic groups that have different kinship intensity. And if our story is true, we look at the borders between those. And as we move from a group with a high kinship intensity to a group with a low kinship intensity, we should see a change consistent with our theory in how much light is illuminated from there. And what this plot is attempting to show is that that's the border between the groups. And when we move from a group with low intensity where there's lots of light, the amount of light goes down in the other group. So this removes a lot of typical hypotheses that would be alternative ways of explaining that. So it goes some distance towards accounting for alternative theories. So overall, this picture is consistent with the idea that kinship norms can affect economic growth. Now, in this story, I'm just going straight from kinship intensity right to economic growth, and I'm not telling you about the intermediate. In the one prior to that with innovation in Europe, I was able to illuminate some of these channels more effectively. And of course, innovation is going to lead to more economic growth. And then at least part of the story behind kinship norms is religion. So I focused on the Catholic Church part of the story, but there's also an Islam part of the story. So Islam has a rule that daughters have to inherit half of what sons inherit. That's great if you're a merchant like Mohammed, but if your wealth is in land, it's a big problem. Because every time you marry a daughter off, your land is going away and your holdings are getting smaller. So what you see emerge in Islamic populations is something that's very rare anthropologically. So patrolateral parallel cousin marriage, which is a fancy way of saying you marry your father's brother's kid. And then the land stays there, right? Because it's, you're just marrying your cousin who's lived in the same area and the land doesn't move away. So it was a way of retaining land, but that threads more dense kinship networks. It makes people more loyal to a small group, kind of tightens things up, strengthens the norms. So that actually may be running the other direction from this idea that you can't marry your cousins and you end up going really far away. And then, of course, there's lots of aspects of ecology. And if I can just do one more slide. So in the Weirdest People in the World, I talk about this work by Thomas Talhelm, who's a social psychologist. And their kinship intensity in China varies with rice agriculture. Rice has certain labor demands that are very intensive, and it tends to promote clan formation. So there you can use just the ecology to predict your intensity of clans, And your intensity of clans predicts you not being inclined to analytic thinking, having a kind of broadened self-concept, and having less in-group loyalty, or more in-group loyalty. So it basically tests the theory within China where the thing that's varying kinship intensity is an ecological factor rather than the church. So you can make these links. Now, since the book came out, Augustin Bergeron, who was a grad student at Harvard, worked with Nathan Nunn and I, he has this paper from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And what he did is he studied people in the city of Kananga, which is the largest city that doesn't have electricity all the time. And he looked at where people came from, the villages, and how close those were to historical Christian missions. So the idea was if your village is close to a historical Christian mission, you got a dosage of this marriage and family program. And he's able to show that the closer your village was to the Christian missions, the lower your kinship intensity, and the lower your kinship intensity, the more moral universalism and less in-group loyalty you have. So he's able to connect the dots just within the DRC, using here the mission location. And then finally, I'll point to this recent work by Goshen colleagues at the University of British Columbia. Now, this is work in the US. So what they did is, the Europeans begin expanding across the US. Populations are small. Protestantism releases the ban on cousin marriage. People start marrying their cousins. And state laws, different states at different times, have put in a law that bans cousin marriage. So he looks at what happens to the families that are having cousin marriage before and after the ban. And the laws work, so people stop marrying their cousins, and look down the road 40 years, more economic growth, higher incomes, more wealth. So it looks like the state laws dropped cousin marriage, and that led to greater income and more urbanization. So it's a nice test of the theory. Okay, so let me wrap up with a couple of take-home messages. So the theory here is that culture strongly shapes economic and political outcomes. In economics and other fields, there's often this discussion of historical legacies, but this gives us a kind of firmer understanding of why historical legacies exist. Things are affected, they become part of the institutions, in this case the family structures, that we then pass down generation after generation, and they recreate themselves because the same psychology is necessary for navigating those institutions. Now, as I mentioned, psychology and kinship are shaped by other aspects of culture, like religion as well as ecology. And a key idea is that psychology and institutions co-evolve culturally. So I just offer that because this discipline of psychology is really founded on that not being true, right? So there's no sense in which this thing that they're measuring that's written up in the psychology textbooks is actually changing. And what's interesting now, psychology is now old enough. We can take the basic measures that were done in the 1950s and show that they've changed just within Americans within 50 years. So that so it's getting harder to hold that case together. But this means psychology and other related fields that rely on psychology are going to need a theory of psychological change. And that's where I'm trying to go here. And then finally, all of this, and nothing in biology or culture makes sense except in the light of evolution. So we can't understand the centrality of kin-based institutions without realizing that we're an ape. I mean, we prefer our relatives. We have incest, inbreeding aversions that shape our kinship institutions. It means that there's always this push to help our friends and our family and do all those things. Kinship institutions will reassert themselves, and maybe, actually, as we're speaking. So, all right, that's it.
We have time for a few questions from the audience. So, yeah, Dan.
So I think it's quite interesting how the first cousin thing was permeating throughout all your slides. And so I'm curious as to, you talk a lot about legal bans for first cousin marriages, but then, for example, in Texas, it's legal to marry a first cousin, yet it doesn't happen very much. Now, in the U.S. South, historically, in the United States, it was more marriage of first cousins. But so what connection in your research, when you have jurisdictions that do allow first cousin marriage, you don't see it very much. In other words, is it because it's socially unacceptable? Is the trend away from first cousin marriage because of legal restrictions? And what about the mix between those two to explain the decline or the lack of first cousin marriage? Because like I say, in Texas, it is legal.
Yeah. So in many cases, you're not going to expect very much cousin marriage because the push against it has become embedded in the sort of secular culture. So of course, Catholicism, it's still not okay to marry your first cousins. But then, even as people secularize, they maintain this idea that it's kind of gross and it's, like your sister. In fact, I love the fact that I've heard Americans describe it as, oh, that would be like marrying your sister. And actually, the hunter-gatherers in the Kalahari also describe it that way. Oh, that'd be like marrying your real sister. Yeah, so my story is, it'd be interesting because you could do an analysis and look at the histories of different populations within Texas and see if you can detect any differences on what the cultural expectations would have been for those different populations.
But is there a connection between a legal prohibition versus a culture prohibition? What's the connection?
Well, I haven't looked into this in detail in the U.S., but my assumption would be that the legal prohibition can bring into line groups that might otherwise want to marry their cousins, but for most people, it doesn't affect them.
And then the lack of it, but then the lack of the legal prohibition. It's interesting how in Texas, first cousin marriage is perfectly lawful, but you just
Sure, we get a question on this side right here. Go ahead.
Hi, first and foremost, thank you for taking the time to be here today. Really appreciate the presentation. Very interesting, a little bit out of my field for me, looking particularly at evolutionary theory. That being said, one thing that stuck out was how you mentioned that we're, as humans, really, what was the word, kind of like repetition machines almost, or?
Imitation machines.
Thank you, imitation machines. So that paints a bit of a stark image on the idea of originality, right? Being just putting ideas together for the sake of innovation, or that being innovation. And this could be a little bit out of the scope of the presentation, but I'm curious, where do original ideas originate? Is there kind of a point, or are we kind of out of original ideas and now we're just throwing things together, or how does that work?
One of the things, so people often think that being an imitation machine means that you don't produce new things. But one of the points I try to make is that if you copy one thing from here and one thing from here, you put them together, you made a new thing, right? So you have an innovation, it's just you did it by copying. And often you take an idea that's present in one domain and maybe apply it in a different domain. So I'm writing a book about this, and one of the fun things I got to do was everybody's example of the super genius, right, is Einstein, right? His name is synonymous. But if you look at the theory of, and so I get to read all this cool history of science, if you look at Einstein's ideas, every single one of the core elements of relativity theory was promulgated by somebody else prior to Einstein. And there was a bunch of people, a bunch of physicists who were trying versions of this. And Einstein just was the guy who got all the key elements right? There was another guy who had 3 of them, but not the 4th one, and so it's just a recombination.
Yeah, there used to be a PBS program called Connections, where there was a British historian of science who was running all over Europe talking about this invention happened because this person got with this person. But again, thank you very much. I came across your stuff about 5 years ago. I'm a comparative economist, and I've sold a few books for you, so you're welcome. The way I think of you talk about kinship, and kinship is sort of connected to that other concept of tribalism. And have you spent any time thinking about linguistic variety in countries, African countries, some countries where you may have 300 or 400 different tribal languages that would seem to be kind of a barrier to communication, and those tribal languages, a question I've had in my mind is, first of all, what's the origin of them? You talked about ecology. To what extent do geographic limitations lead to the development of that kind of variety in language? But then after you've developed that level of variety in language, to what extent does a language become an instrument of tribalism? It's sort of a protective mechanism to keep our kinship group, our tribe, separate from others. And have you looked at how that fits into the rest of this system?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question because, it seems like with the story that anthropology and history tells us about languages is that, if you give enough separation between groups, languages are going to differentiate over time. You can even see that today in English, right? So it's harder and harder to understand people who are speaking different dialects of English, right? It takes more and more work and then imagine 100 years from now, 200 years from now. And you can see that one of the interesting things about China is what united the elite was that they could read the same language, even though they spoke mutually unintelligible languages, so they had to communicate by writing. Latin, of course, provided that in Europe. So figuring out a common form of communication is crucial to getting this collective brain to work. And of course, as you mentioned, one of the things that people do with language is they try to use it as an identity marker. It seems to be an important identity marker. But that's why they're so hard to get big collective brains, because there's these forces of human cultural evolution that causes us to break down into parts. So the trick is institutions that don't let that happen or inhibit it. Yeah.
Again, thank you for being here. But I had a question on, you had a psychological variation chart that kind of talked about weird populations and samples on individualism. How would samples on individualism even be taken, and how is that comparative from one culture to another, and how would we define that?
Yeah, so psychologists have developed a number of different techniques, and one is just a questionnaire that asks you about the role of your family and how you think about yourself. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. One is the 20 statements task, where you answer the question, I am, and you fill in the blank. And so if you do that in Ohio, and I'm thinking of an actual study, every single person answers with I'm curious, I'm a kayaker, I'm smart. And they don't say, I'm a father, I'm a brother, I'm a member of this group, those kinds of things. They don't give those kinds of answers. And then you give it among the Maasai, which is a population that inhabits both Kenya and Tanzania, and almost all their answers are relational. Something about how they're related to some member or some other group in some way that endures for their whole life. So that's one way. Another way is the sociogram task, where you are asked to draw circles for you and your friends. And individualists make themselves much bigger than their small circled friends. But in Japan, they make themselves slightly smaller than their friends. So this is another technique that psychologists have tried. So little clever things like that.
Hi, thank you for the fascinating talk. So if I have followed your argument correctly, Western religion is leading us to have lower kinship and stronger individualism. But I'm trying to reconcile that with the psychology of religion literature that looks at the United States that shows that religiousness is related to more prejudice, but that in China, Buddhism is maybe unrelated to prejudice. Is it just that we're looking at different levels of analysis, or?
Yeah, I mean, the story that I lay out, the narrative that I lay out in that is that the church, it has these effects of the family on psychology, and then it eventually leads, I see this all as getting us to Protestantism, which is a super individualistic faith that's very much based on mental states. So, by faith alone, you get to heaven. Doesn't matter what you do. That's just showing how mentalistic it is. And there's none of this community that's part of Catholicism. And then when the individual can read the Bible for themselves and make their own judgments, I haven't done research on this, but the story that I like is that leads to atheism. Because once everybody can have an opinion, and we can have an opinion about the nature of the supernatural beings and whatnot, you eventually get to what we think of as secularism. But the secularism of the modern world is where universal human values are, where a lot of these ideas, but those all start before that, right? So, and I'll just leave it there.
Joe, I'll ask one myself. An alternative explanation for the relationship between the role of the church in medieval Europe and economic growth and innovation and so forth is one not only about how the doctrines affected behavior and psychology, but also sort of other aspects of the institutional environment, like in particular the fact that the church was transnational and that you had this sort of overlapping jurisdictions with different polities that in fact sort of limited the ability of the elites to appropriate value. You had more sort of property rights and more decentralized forms of organization. I think that's the story from people like David Landis, Joe Mocure. Is that consistent with your story? Is that sort of layered on top of your story?
Well, so one of the techniques that I like to use, oh, yikes, wrong way. That's my Italy stuff that I cut. So the theory should be applicable elsewhere. And so if my story, say there's an alternative hypothesis which is well supported or difficult to falsify that competes with my story, the easiest thing to do is leave Europe and go somewhere where that story can't possibly apply. And so Augustin Bergeron gets the same story in the DRC. We have this pattern in China, and we have this effect in the US. So there's definitely, anyway, their special case story can't account for that finding. Or I have my global kinship and economic growth finding with the satellites.
Terrific. Any other questions? I know it's late. I don't want to give you all a chance to get home and give Dr. Henrich a chance to relax a little bit. So, okay, well, Joe, thank you so much for coming. Thanks for the really interesting talk. We appreciate you being here. Thanks to everybody for coming out tonight.